What's going on, Packer fans? Welcome back to another episode of the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. I'm once again joined by our resident NFC North expert. You can find her on Twitter at Carmen V. She, of course, is Carmen Vitali, the NFC North expert, also for Fox Sports, but more importantly for the Pack a Day podcast. Carmen, how the heck are you doing?
I'm good. Something's going around, but just trying to keep up with everything happening and deal with, seasonal allergies and sickness and stuff like that. It's real fun.
Yeah, it is that time of year. Temperature changes seem to always lead to this sort of stuff, but temperature changes don't always lead to a 0-4 week in the NFC North, to a weird week in Chicago, to a trade of running backs or a running back to Minnesota, I should say. We'll cover all of that, but let's start with the 0-4 week. I brought you in as the NFC North expert, and immediately the NFC North goes 0-4. I'm just saying.
Is this my fault? Is this my fault?
Might be. But Packers lose to the Falcons, Vikings lose to the Eagles on Thursday Night Football, Bears lose to the Buccaneers, Lions lose to the Seahawks. It looked for a second, the Vikings had already lost. The Packers were up two scores against Atlanta. The Bears were losing. The Lions were down double digits in the fourth quarter. It looked like for a second the Packers were going to be kings of the NFC North, but unfortunately, all four teams eventually lose. I'll let you start anywhere. The floor is yours. Your thoughts on the week that was in the NFC North.
Yeah, I was in Detroit actually at the Seahawks-Lions game. That was the game that I was covering this past weekend. And I will say you still saw a lot of good things out of the Lions, and the fact that they were down so much with 8 minutes to go. They're down multiple scores in the fourth quarter, and they come back and they force overtime. And you just think that, a team that comes from behind and gets to overtime is going to eventually win that game. But then, of course, we saw the coin toss goes in the Seahawks' favor. They go down the field, they score. The defense was totally gassed, very injured. The Lions did not come out of that unscathed either, to add insult to injury, literally. So that's going to be very interesting, monitoring them going forward and how much that's going to affect them. But the fact that they were able to rally was a good sign. I think that the Packers came a little bit down to earth just because of the fact that you realize that this is still a young team and they're still going to have to figure some stuff out. Obviously, surrendering that 12-point lead in the fourth quarter just isn't something that you want to see, especially out of a defense that has as much talent as the Packers does. And I feel like maybe their run defense woes aren't totally solved. But again, some really encouraging stuff from Jordan Love. As soon as he starts completing more of these passes, I mean, it's going to be, his stats are already getting up there. Best passer rating in the league still. And his touchdown ratio, I believe, is the best in the league as well. And I just think that he's just, as soon as he completes more of these passes, that those stats are going to get even more padded. And then the Vikings, I don't, it's just, you don't see very often a team that went 13-4 now go 0-2, potentially 0-3. But I still think that there is hope for them, and there's hope for them in this division, which is not something I can say about the Bears at this point. There's so much that is wrong with that team, on and off the field. And I didn't have, honestly, I thought that the Bucs were going to win that game, and they did, even though the Bears ended up having a chance. But then Justin Fields throws that pick six after the third straight inside screen at their own goal line, which totally made sense, that we haven't gotten any clarity on since. Anyway, so that's a long-winded way of saying that, yeah, I mean, things went badly, but I think the only irredeemable game was probably the Bears and Bucs.
There's so much to go over there. All right, let's start with Detroit, who, not like you said, they lose the game. I also, from a just a Detroit standpoint, was sort of buoyed by the fact that they did come back. They put up 10 quick points to get it into overtime. They end up not winning, but again, I said a week ago, there's not many Detroit teams in my lifetime that go into Kansas City and win that game. There's not many Detroit teams in my lifetime that are down 10 with 8 minutes left to go in the fourth quarter and get that game to overtime. So still, I think a disappointing loss for them, but they're still going to be a really tough out through the remainder of the season. I think the bigger thing for them is they lose Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, James Houston in the process. Those are going to be some pretty big injuries for them, specifically Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, who, obviously one of their big acquisitions in a defensive backfield that needed a couple big acquisitions. And he already was kind of inserting himself as a leader in that defensive backfield. So that's going to be a tough loss for them.
Yeah, it was really interesting because we talked to CJ in the locker room right afterwards, and he seemed fine. He was talking, about the future and the weeks going forward as if he was going to be a part of it. Inside the building, everyone was also shocked. No, a lot of the coaches, even defensive coaches, did not see that coming, and the fact that his injury was that severe and that he was going to be out for an extended period of time. So that all kind of came as a shock to pretty much everybody. Um, because again, like I said, he was in good spirits in the locker room. And James Houston, I mean, this pass rush is not what it needs to be, what it should be, what it was at the tail end of last season. The interesting part of the Detroit pass rush is that Aiden Hutchinson has the most pressures of any player in the league right now. He's just not getting home. So that's just not going to fly with this defense. It puts a lot more pressure on the back end of it, which now is riddled with injuries with CJ. And I mean, Kirby Joseph got banged up in that game, and you just don't have the depth there that you perhaps want now that there are so many injuries. So that's definitely something to monitor in Detroit at this point, and is really kind of deflating from what they could have been or should have been, even in that game against the Seahawks.
Yeah, and then from a Jordan Love standpoint in Green Bay, I think you bring up a great point. I think just that level of consistency is, I think, the last thing to put together, because we've seen the high highs, we've seen the consistency he's played with from like a command of the offense and going through his reads and progressions, but there are points. I pointed to the second quarter against Chicago where things were very disjointed on offense. We saw it a little bit at the beginning of this game against Atlanta, and then certainly in the fourth quarter where they couldn't get anything going. That's not just on Jordan Love. That's everything all encompassing, from a young group of playmakers to an offensive line that's right now a little bit in flux. But that, even going back to training camp specifically, is something that we saw out of Jordan in this offense, where there would be moments and times where they would be in rhythm and it would look really, really good. And there'd be other times where it just looked disjointed. And I think we've seen that through two games where if there isn't that rhythm, things look a little bit off. And I think it's just putting together a full 4-quarter game that Green Bay is going to have to learn to do, because if they don't, they learned exactly what can happen when you let a team stick around. And Atlanta, it was able to come back and come from 12 points down to really kind of steal a victory from the jaws of defeat.
Yeah, it was impressive that, I mean, the Packers were even in that position going into the fourth quarter, given the fact that you do have multiple offensive linemen out and you don't have Aaron Jones, and you're trying to make things happen with, you don't even have Christian Watson. So you're trying to make things happen with younger receivers. And it's hard to have that rhythm when you didn't have all the guys that you were practicing with this offseason and into the preseason either. So the fact that the Packers were able to be as efficient as they were, the fact that Jordan Love was able to be as efficient as he was, that's one of those periods, though, that you really need to be able to lean on your defense, and your defense needs to be able to pick you up. And there just really aren't a lot of excuses for that Green Bay defense to not continue to come up with stops into the fourth quarter, put together 4 quarters of good play, because of the fact that you don't have as many injuries on that side of the ball and you have so much talent. And you shouldn't have your essentially rookie, your first year starting quarterback who's in his third start ever, having to pick you up. That's just not how this is supposed to work yet. The Packers were very intentional with how they set up Jordan Love, and that should include a defense that he can lean on in times like this where you are a little bit out of rhythm, you do have injuries along the line, and you do have injuries to your skill players.
Yeah, it's so funny. Daniel Jeremiah, Move the Sticks podcast, they always talk about, is the quarterback a truck or a trailer? Meaning that if you're a truck, you can carry the team behind you. If you're a trailer, the rest of the team kind of has to pull you. This was supposed to be sort of set up as a season where Jordan Love didn't have to be the truck. He could have been the guy that everything else around him kind of has to go well. You're sort of evaluating Jordan. You didn't necessarily need or really want him to have to be the guy that was kind of carrying the rest of the team. But it kind of felt like at times he had to be the guy that was carrying the team. And you were wondering, was he going to be able to carry them through on that final, fourth quarter drive to get them to a victory? He had the amazing throw on fourth down that just unfortunately fell incomplete, and they had the penalty on the play anyway. And it ends up being a turnover on downs. But a lot of things to like from Jordan in this game and through the first 2 weeks. But as we talked about, it's now going to have to be a 4-quarter performance from everyone involved, not just Jordan. But if not, they're going to have, I think, more of those tough one. I think this is going to be a competitive team all year long. I don't think there's going to be much doubt about that. But I think they are going to be in a lot of these 1-score games on one side or the other. And it's going to be those exact attention to details that are going to define if they are on the winning end of those, or like we saw this past Sunday on the losing end of those. I thought overall, like the least to take away was kind of from the Vikings game. Yes, they lose, but that was a really tough ask on a Thursday night turnaround following a tough loss, going into Philadelphia against one of the best teams in football. They hung around. They did a decent job, but I don't fault them too much for falling in that game. I think the vast majority of the teams in the same situation probably would have gone into Philadelphia and lost in that game. But then, as you mentioned, the Chicago Bears, the consecutive screen passes it was almost worse that it was a 3-point game in Justin Fields' hands to have the opportunity to go down and tie or take the lead, to have what happened next happened, where he throws the pick on they throw back to back, I think, inside screens in 2 plays, I think, in a row that were the exact same play. Yes. And of course it kind of ends as you would expect it to. Pick six, game over. Baker Mayfield and the Bucs 2-0, just like we all expected going into the year. But now you have this really bizarre week where I think Justin, I don't think he certainly wasn't misquoted. He said it, clear and obvious as day that hey, coaching is maybe one of the reasons he's overthinking things. I don't think he maybe thought through the entire connotation of what he was saying and how that was going to be perceived. I think he's probably saying there's a lot of voices and a lot of things that are, he's trying to parse down and trying to go through a play and make sure that it's right. And it's just probably a little bit of paralysis by analysis, but that whole thing gets taken and going on in a whole direction where he speaks again to the media. Then Ryan Pace speaks to the media. That's all a whole, and that's one of the things. You have the defensive coordinator resigned with a myriad of bizarre stuff that's potentially surrounding that I don't even know if we want to get into because it's part hearsay, part whatever. And maybe part two, we just don't know. And then you've got, they release Nate Peterman. They pick him back up the next day. Also, probably the least of their concerns at this. It's just been a very odd week in Chicago.
Oh, and by the way, their left tackle is on IR. So there's
for a while.
It was just, and we don't know, Matt Eberflus would not rule out Braxton Jones' injury being season ending. We heard that Ryan Poles was speaking about Braxton Jones today, and it didn't seem like it was going to be season ending, but there's no clarity on that. The Nathan Peterman thing was just kind of the cherry on top. Oh, by the way, it was Ryan Poles' birthday yesterday, or on Wednesday. But the Nathan Peterman thing was they were trying to bring in another offensive lineman to the 53-man roster and elevate off of somebody else's practice squad. That didn't work out. So that's why they initially vacated the spot with Nathan Peterman. They had every intention of just putting him on the practice squad, but then that fell through. And so that Nate Peterman goes back onto the 53-man roster. That's apparently what happened, which does happen. But I mean, everything is just happening. So it's not swinging the Bears' way in any way, shape, or form. I have a lot of thoughts just about Justin Fields kind of coming out and saying what he did and not being misquoted, but then, talking to the media about how he knows it's our job to get clicks and this and that and the other. And I'm just like, that's not what was happening there. There was one tweet that said one word. But other than that, I feel like everything else was very representative of what you were saying. And if you misspoke, say that's not what I meant. I want to further clarify. This is what I did mean. That's totally fine to me. But please don't come at the Chicago media, the wonderful people that work on that beat, and say that they are purposely trying to divide you as a team. That's not a thing that they're trying to do. They're just trying to get to the bottom of what is going wrong in Chicago, because so many things are going wrong. The play calling isn't good. The quarterback play is not good. And clearly there is a disconnect between how Justin Fields wants to play and who he is as a player and the system that he is currently in. I understand that there's the paralysis by analysis thing, but at the same time, this is his third year in the NFL. You are not allowed to say that in your second year in this system. We talked so much this offseason about how he was going to have continuity finally, and he was going to be entering into a system that he was familiar with for once in his pro career. And so you don't really get to say, I have too much information to process. That's part of being a quarterback in the NFL. You have to be able to process information in real time and make decisions based on what you're seeing. And we're not seeing that out of Justin. And I think I don't think he trusts the play calling. I don't think he trusts his protection. I don't think he trusts pretty much anything around him. So it's going to be very interesting them going into Kansas City and him saying that he's going to kind of revert back to who he is as a player and who he was last year. Unfortunately, that was left something to be desired as from an evaluation standpoint for the Bears, which I think is why you saw them trying to make him into this rhythm passer in this rhythm passing offense, because that's what Getsy knows. That's what Getsy runs. Luke Getsy obviously comes from the Packers, and he was the quarterback's coach for a guy that maybe didn't need a whole lot of coaching. or didn't want it, whichever one. And now that's all he knows. And so that inexperience is showing. This is his first time calling plays and molding an offense into what he wants particularly. So it's so discombobulated. And it doesn't seem fixable from any aspect of this. So going into Kansas City is going to be very interesting. I think that Steve Spagnuolo is an excellent defensive coordinator for the Kansas City Chiefs. And we all heard Justin say that he's probably going to play a little bit more of that backyard football that makes, he's so athletic. That's what makes him so good. Yeah. And I just think that if we heard it, that means Spags and the Kansas City Chiefs heard it too.
Yeah, this is going to be such a huge, and I know it's going into Kansas City, so I think we pretty much know how this one's probably going to end, but it does feel like there's almost a little bit more pressure on Justin Fields. Like, it just feels like, as you mentioned, your job as a quarterback is to process information in milliseconds of time and distribute the ball to your playmakers. Yeah, it's like that's the job description. Now, I do think Chicago's done a terrible job of kind of utilizing some of the things that he really does well and best and putting him in positions to succeed. Obviously, the talent around him, specifically more from a blocking standpoint, hasn't been great by any means. So there's a lot that's going on around Justin too. But like, if you can't win as a pocket passer, and now you're going to go out and play maybe a little bit more playground style football and just swing it and let it go, like, okay, and maybe things do go better. Maybe that does just suit you a little bit better, but there is a ceiling to what you can do with that as a player. Like, you might be a pain in the butt to some teams in the regular season, but once, once teams start really scheming you, especially if I say this half jokingly, but if you ever get to a playoff sort of situation, teams know how to shut that down pretty easily. And we've seen that, I think, through the course of a lot of mobile quarterbacks' careers, where you can only do so much. And at some point you have to beat teams with your arm as a quarterback. So yeah, it's a mess in Chicago. And one of the things that I always look at draft time, not pre-draft, but as soon as the draft is done, is really going through and getting excited about the teams that were put in a situation where they can succeed and the scheme matches the player. And it just seems like a seamless fit. And Justin Fields in Chicago, and I'm not saying necessarily post-draft, but right now in Chicago, the matchup of the scheme and the player doesn't seem to be the right matchup right now. And that's disappointing, obviously, from an NFL standpoint. And I know we've talked a little bit about the Bears so far this week on the show with a couple of different people. And I know some people are like, well, this is a Packers podcast, but like, this is a Bears team that holds their own first round pick and a Bears team that holds the Panthers first round pick in a draft that has some extremely explosive players at the top of next draft, including Caleb Williams, including Marvin Harrison Jr., and among many others. And if they have picks 1 and 3, 2 and 4, 2 and 3, whatever it may be, like maybe 1 and 2, like that is going to be a massive earth-shattering moment for the NFC North. And they could completely reload. They could be a new coach. They're like, we don't know what's going to happen next in Chicago. So a lot of chaos right now, but that chaos is going to affect the NFC North in a major way going forward, good, bad, or ugly.
Yeah, it's going to be, I feel like the Bears are entering into a crossroads of either they're going to stick with Getsy and his system because Ryan Poles did put together a team that has the personnel to run Getsy's system other than the quarterback. The Bears have been in 11 personnel, 78.4% so far this season through 2 games. That's the 4th highest rate in the NFL, which I don't think anybody is surprised with, knowing where Getsy comes from. And he comes from that Shanahan-McVay tree that relies so heavily on that personnel grouping. And you've seen that reflected in the personnel that Ryan Poles has built this team with. When you look at the receivers, you look at DJ Moore, who's a fast, quick kind of all over the place number one that can come out of any alignment. He's not necessarily that big, strong outside dude that's going to get you, those 50-50 balls down the field. But then you also have Chase Claypool, you have Darnell Mooney, and you have a running back by committee where that's not really the focal point of this offense. That is not the kind of offense that Justin Fields is built for. So now you have to figure out, are you going to stick with Justin or are you going to stick with Luke Getsy? And that's kind of where the Bears have to figure out moving forward how this is going to go. And it's not going to go well if you keep things status quo, which is if you choose Luke Getsy, Justin Fields is not going to be able to, I feel, for like fully assimilate into this offense and execute it the way it needs to be executed. At the same time, bringing someone else in other than Luke, that probably doesn't work at this point of the season either. So they are just between a rock and a hard place in every way imaginable. And you have to kind of try to figure out some sort of balance right now. But it's so frustrating for Bears fans to see this over and over again, and then see the Packers excel at this succession plan where they are able to bring in these generational quarterbacks. I'm not saying Jordan Love's there yet, but they are able to usher in a quarterback, and they know exactly how to do it, exactly what to do, what to equip him with, how he's going to, assimilate into that offense and how he's going to fit in. That is something that the Packers do very well, and it's not something the Bears have ever been able to do, and it might have to do with the inexperience of the offensive coordinator, having a defensive head coach. That's not necessarily the recipe to develop a young quarterback when you see in Green Bay, you have an experienced play caller in Matt LaFleur. You have a guy that, is entering into a situation where he has a run game to lean on. Like we talked about, the defense that he should be able to lean on, a really good offensive line. Those are not things that Justin Fields has in Chicago, and you are seeing the stark contrast between how these two teams are approaching trying to develop a young quarterback.
Yeah, it's a really great point. And Carmen has a great article over about that exact thing on Fox Sports as well. So definitely check that out. One thing I'll say is I would have bet going into yesterday, that there was almost no chance that Luke Getsy makes it through the season because, like you said, there's one of two ways, right? You either have to move on from Getsy or you have to move on from Justin Fields. And right now, the coaching staff is going to start hearing of like, all right, they're going to have to start over completely in Chicago. Like that's going to start gaining traction. It's already there. And then you start getting desperate. Well, here's the thing: at quarterback, you've got Nathan Peterman and Tyson Bagent. They're not going to that's not going to get you anywhere at this point to make the switch to either of those guys. So you by default, you have to stick with Justin, and then it becomes an offensive coordinator issue. The issue being your defensive coordinator just resigned yesterday, making it like you're already going on to a different defensive coordinator now. Are you really going to go to a different offensive coordinator as well? Like that's a lot of turmoil to go with as well. And if your coach can't choose the right offensive coordinator and the defensive coordinator's already resigned, like then the coach looks that much weaker as well because he can't choose that. Like it, right. You talk about rock in a hard place. They are in a nightmare of a place organizationally. And I have a really good friend who's a Chicago Bears fan. And, he talks about this all the time of like, they also like constantly, they're never aligned with GM, coach, and quarterback. It's always right. Like the coach is working or the GM's working with a previous coach or the quarterback that got brought in from the last regime. So it's like, all right, so you move on from Fields and you move on from Eberflus. Now does Ryan Pace stay and get to choose his next quarterback and then bring on a different coach? And then like, it's just this constant wheel of motion. It's like freaking Game of Thrones.
There isn't a clear or maybe even right answer at this point. I mean, everything that happened, the circumstances surrounding the defensive coordinator, Alan Williams' departure, have just been bizarre to say the least. Obviously, I'm not going to speculate on the rumors that are out there because this isn't something that you can be wrong about. And quite frankly, I hope that the sourcing that I have that tells me what the real story is wrong. Yeah. But that's one of those things where this is now, Ryan Poles came out today and said it, we are going through adversity. There's no other way to say it, essentially. And yeah, I mean, depending on how that situation ends up unfolding with the defensive coordinator, I think can also have a huge implication on whether or not the Bears move on from Matt Eberflus. Because again, like you just said, the offensive coordinator does not fit with this quarterback. Even if you get rid of the quarterback, though, the fact that you didn't see that or you couldn't make that work, and then for completely different reasons, your defensive coordinator didn't work out either, that implicates Matt Eberflus, unfortunately. And so not that you ever want to call for someone's job or you want them to lose it so quickly, this is only his second year, but I have to think that how that situation ends up playing out with Alan Williams, and if there's any new information that ends up coming out, or if we get any clarity as to what these circumstances were, that is going to directly impact Matt Eberflus, maybe even Ryan Poles. And that has nothing to do with what is happening with Justin Fields and Luke Getsy and this coaching staff on the field. So it's just, there's so many levels of dysfunction right now in Chicago. And I do feel for Bears fans in tremendously, because I didn't think the season was going to go well. No one could have predicted, just how poorly and how quickly this would go off the rails. I mean, we're in week 3 here.
Yeah. Did I say Ryan Pace earlier? If I did, I meant
You
Ryan
did, but
Poles.
that's okay. I mean, it's easy, like Ryan Pace and Matt Nagy to Ryan Poles and Matty.
I know.
So it's been Ryan and Matt. Just if you're in doubt, just say Ryan and Matt.
I know, right? I would say it won't happen again, but it probably will happen again because Ryan Pace is just ultimately stuck in my head for some reason. But either way, really quick thoughts on the Cam Akers trade, pivoting to Minnesota really quick. They obviously, I don't think they've gotten exactly what they expected out of Alexander Mattison so far. Was probably really solid in that number 2 role to Dalvin Cook in previous years. Gets to be the guy this year. I don't think it's gone 100% according to plan. They pick up Cam Akers, kind of a late pick for him, but thoughts on that fit in Minnesota?
Well, I mean, they didn't have Dalvin Cook on an island by himself either. Dalvin Cook had Alexander Mattison. So I don't think it was fair to expect Alexander Mattison to shoulder the load entirely without having an equivalent of himself to back him up. So I do think that this was a good move, and this will just help them be a little bit more productive, get more productivity out of that position, I should say. They don't need to have a triple-digit rushing game every single game. That's not how this offense is built. We were just talking about, I mean, Kevin O'Connell is also part of the Shanahan-McVay tree. His offense relies heavily on that 11 personnel grouping as well. So they don't need a ton of production, but they do need a lot from the run game as far as being able to set up other concepts within their offense. So I like Cam Akers coming in. Kevin O'Connell is also very familiar with him from his time with the Rams, and they overlapped there. So it makes a lot of sense. He knows exactly what he's getting in Cam. Now you just hope that Cam Akers can stay healthy. I think that's the big question mark, obviously, coming in. But he's not coming in to be the guy. And I think that you saw that reflected in Wes Phillips' statements, talking about how they have not lost any faith in Alexander Mattison. It's just about a matter of getting him and setting him up in the same situation that Dalvin Cook was last year, which having a true number 2 guy that he can rely on and split carries with and just kind of go back and forth with.
Yeah, we've seen Minnesota not be afraid to pull the trigger on those sort of trades the past couple of years, getting TJ Hawkinson from Detroit last year. Now they get Cam Akers from the Rams this year. They see something they think they can help their team, they're going to go get them. And in this case, they go out and get Cam Akers, and we will see how that helps them moving forward, or if it helps them. I really like the slate of games this week in the NFC North for a variety of different reasons. Bears Chiefs on paper obviously is ugly, but with what's happened in Chicago this week and the Justin Fields comments, it almost feels like a must watch. Even if it's a train wreck, it almost feels like I just am really interested to see how this game goes. Even if we already, like, spoiler alert, like it's like watching the Titanic movie, you know how it's going to end, but you kind of want to watch anyway.
Apparently Justin Fields had the best practice that they've seen him have yesterday. He was really fired up all practice, and it seems like he now really has a fire lit under him and he has something to prove. So I'm not going to go against the NFL script. Like, who knows, man? Like,
that's true. Who knows? But that's why it's like it's a lot more fun. Like, if there was no Bears drama this week and it was just a normal Bears week, Bears Chiefs is an awful matchup, but it feels more fun now. It feels more interesting. Vikings Chargers is one of there's always this matchup in week 3 every year where you get 2 teams that had playoff aspirations that are both sitting at 0-2. And we know the NFL is crazy enough that it's not exactly an elimination game, but it almost feels like an elimination game in week 3. So both of those teams are going to be super desperate. You have the added on, West Coast team going to a noon game. That's not exactly East Coast, but you're still going, in Minnesota from, obviously from LA. And then you also got the Vikings having extra rest from playing the Thursday night game. So that's a really intriguing one. You got Lions, Falcons. Lions come off the tough loss. Falcons just beat the Packers. So like you have kind of this preview almost of like the Lions play the Packers on Thursday Night Football next week. How do they fare against the Falcons that just beat the Packers? And then you've got Packers Saints, a matchup of another NFC South, NFC North matchup where I think this one could go either way. And you got the 2-0 Saints against a Packers team who probably should be 2-0. I really like this slate of games overall.
Yeah, I do too. I'm going up to Minnesota actually for this Chargers game. And as much as it could feel like an elimination game, I don't think that Minnesota is under as much pressure at all as the Chargers are. I mean, we all saw the Brandon Staley press conference from a few days ago, and clearly there is a lot of frustration in Los Angeles, and there has been. I mean, this has been building now over the course of a couple of seasons, especially because you have such a dynamic quarterback in Justin Herbert that you don't feel like you're getting enough out of him. On paper, that roster should be winning. They should be a juggernaut, and they're just not. And I feel like if they end up going into Minnesota and losing that game, I might sneak into the Brandon Staley press conference rather than Kevin O'Connell's, just because I feel like that there could be some real stuff that goes down.
Totally. Yeah.
I think that the Chargers are under an extreme amount of pressure there. But yeah, I mean, I don't know what to make about the Saints. I didn't know what to make of the Saints prior to this season. I don't have a ton of faith in Derek Carr. I didn't necessarily think that was a needle moving move. He is who he is. And I just think that Aaron Jones being back for the Packers is going to make a huge difference. And that's going to be the difference maker, and to help the Packers kind of get their confidence back, and Jordan Love to get his confidence back going down to New Orleans. So it's such a weird game, and it's just going to depend on which of these guys are which of these teams are healthier, honestly. And then, the Falcons and taking on the Lions, it's just going to be, the Lions need a win right now with all the injuries that they have. And I really think that could come against the Falcons, but at the same time, Bijan Robinson has been everything and more that the Falcons want him to be. And he makes that offense so incredibly dynamic, even with a big question mark under center with Desmond Ridder. So if the Lions can figure out a way to generate a pass rush and turn those Aiden Hutchinson pressures into sacks, I think the Lions are going to have a much better chance of that. But yeah, we're going to see the Bears. I'm not putting anything past them. I mean, it's been a very emotional week for them, and we've seen teams rise to that occasion and just come and shock the world. But we've also seen teams continue to crumble.
And I agree, obviously, with everything. And I think, from a Bears-Chiefs standpoint, like the Chiefs lost their first game at Arrowhead, them going 0-2 to start the season at Arrowhead, like that just seems like it's probably not. But like you said, the NFL scriptwriters, you never quite know. I'm still going Lions, Packers, Vikings, Bears, and my power rankings 1 through 4 for the NFC North. You still feeling the same way?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I mean, even though the Lions, like every single team lost, and I don't think that you really lost any faith in anyone but maybe the Chicago Bears, if that faith hadn't already been lost. So yeah, I'm going Lions, Packers, Vikings, Bears as far as my NFC North power rankings.
Still. We are in lockstep once again. Carmen, you are absolutely amazing. Tell our listeners where they can find your work and where we can follow you on social media.
Sure. Foxsports.com is where all of my written pieces show up. Anything that I'm doing, whether it's on podcast appearances or my articles or just my general thoughts and meanderings, end up on my Twitter or my X, at CarmyV, which I think is in the bottom of the screen right now. That is me on Twitter, X/Instagram as well. So follow me there.
Make sure to check out all of her work. She does an amazing job covering the NFC North. Of course, you can follow the podcast at Pack-A-Day Podcast. You can follow me at Andy Herman NFL. If you have not yet checked out the Pack-A-Day Podcast YouTube subscriptions, definitely make sure to do so. I will be right back here tomorrow with Mike Wall, so make sure not to miss that. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.